This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and 20% off, go to squarespace.com and use the offer code MacVoices9. Welcome to MacNotables on Mac Voices. This is the Talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner, and it's been a long time since we've been able to corral Bryan Chaffin. He's been busy writing a novel and writing material for the Mac Observer and doing the Apple Context Machine and all kind of things. Bryan, it's great to have you back. I've missed you.
Chuck, I miss you too. It's always good to be on your show, whichever show that may actually be, and I appreciate you having me back.
Hey, I say it so often. There's so many great people, and I never get a chance to talk to them. But there are always some favorites, and it's always fun when you and I get on because we're good friends, but we also have such widely divergent views on a few things.
It's true. But all I can hear when you say that is "suck it, everybody else." I'm one of Chuck's favorites.
Well, if that's what you heard, I don't remember saying that, but whatever works.
That's all I heard. La, 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 la. Can't tell me anything else.
So let's see. There's so many things, Bryan, but I was so happy to see you and Jeff Gamet kind of revive the Apple Context Machine. And
thanks.
now it's back on a pretty regular schedule, which I just love.
Very regular schedule.
Yeah.
We've actually done every Wednesday now since March. That is probably a first for us.
Well, what is intriguing to me is there's this little thread starting to run through it of characters and situations that it's going beyond just what you've done in the past. It's sort of developing a little world of its own.
Chuck, I'm for good or for ill, I'm the instigator for most of that. Jeff is such a willing accomplice, and he's such an encourager and facilitator. But I mean, I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. And I'll just get some crazy idea and want to run with it. But I guess you're talking about our interns, Ainsley and Sierra.
I'm talking about the interns. I'm talking about the occasional little venture into almost old-time radio with sound effects and Foley and everything.
I love doing that stuff. We've done several skits now. We did several years ago. We did one that was a little kid getting Windows. I think Windows 7 for Christmas, and how upset he was. And when we came back, we did this whole thing about how we'd been imprisoned by some sort of, in a cave somewhere, and it's just completely ridiculous, and I have a lot of fun doing it. So I thank you for noticing.
Right, absolutely, and I don't want to take away anything from Apple Context Machine. You still deliver, the great analysis and great views on things, but it just does make it a little fun. And the interns, where did the interns come from?
I don't even know. I think I wanted to blame something on the interns, and so we quickly we did so, and then they had to have names, so we came up with millennial names. My intern is named Sierra, which I think is hilarious because that's such an androgynous name, and Jeff's intern is named Ainsley with two E's. We managed to find a way of spelling Ainsley with two E's because so many parents of millennials just are just absolutely obsessed with giving their children precious, unique snowflake names. And I have no idea where some of this stuff comes from, but it's great fun. I've got a set now in Logic. I basically have a set of effects that when we both talk a certain way whenever we're doing our those intern characters, but I've got a set effect that I apply to them each time so that they hopefully sound younger. So anyway, it's silly. I don't even know where it comes from.
So is there a chance that Ainsley and Sierra could have their own spin-off show at some point?
Well, we have talked about having Ainsley and Sierra hijack the show and like sneak an episode out, but we don't really know what they would do. I mean, they're millennials. They don't really have a lot to say, whether or not they know that. I'm being I'm being ageist here. I'm definitely being an elitist jerk when I say that. But it's possible, but we're not specifically planning anything up.
Okay. Well, it makes it fun. It makes it, just takes you off balance a little bit when you listen to the show, because like, sometimes you guys are playing very straight, and you analyze news and product announcements and all, and then once in a while, it's like, what, the fireworks went off in the studio one time or something? It's just completely off the wall.
Place caught fire, and then all of Jeff's podcasting juice caught on fire too. It was a complete mess, but we had them clean it up, so that's okay.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
The thing that no one has commented on yet, and we've had Melissa Holt on the show twice to do tips, and we call it a quickie with Melissa, and because she's just awesome that way. And both times that we've introduced her, we've started it off with something called Jeff and Brian's Love Seat, which is supposed to be love seat, by the way. It sounds like love scene sometimes when I say it, but it's love seat. And it's supposed to be where we're giving relationship advice to men. And we always get right up to the point where we're saying that we're about to announce something really important, and then Melissa interrupts us. So, it's like right at the key moment where there's supposed to be some key piece of advice, Melissa interrupts us, and we go off into her tip with never an explanation. And no one's actually said anything about it, but that's one of the running gags that cracks me up.
Again, it makes it fun. It makes it a little bit different. It makes you guys seem more human. I think it's a great idea. I think, and especially the fact that it's an audio podcast, it lets your mind kind of go wherever your mind takes you. Yeah,
it's definitely a radio-based kind of thing. We could never do it with we could not do what we're doing with we could do animation, I suppose, but that would never happen.
Yeah.
Animation. I would so love to animate some of our podcasts, especially some of the ones where we do go off in crazy directions. That would be so much fun, but I couldn't even begin to do that.
All right, so I think I just heard a call to amateur animators out there for an unpaid gig to
yes,
help bring this. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Hours and hours and hours of your time for no money. Please sign up soon.
Hey, just to be part of Apple Context Machine, you never know.
Enough.
You never
Fair
know.
Enough.
You never know. Well, God, there's so much stuff here. I made just a few notes. And I have to say that one character that I'm sorry to see will have to be retired sometime soon is Mr. Balmer.
Yeah.
With Steve stepping down, the what is it, the doppelganger Balmer or whatever?
Fake Steve Balmer.
Fake Steve Balmer will not be able to make any more appearances, or at least not in the same way.
Not in the same way. Not in some sort of doofus Microsoftian way, that's for sure, which will be kind of sad, but I've been wanting him to go for so long, for the sake of Microsoft, for the sake of competition in the industry, that I'll take the sacrifice.
Well, maybe in the tradition of Star Wars, if he gets struck down, he'll become more powerful than you can imagine.
Good Lord, that's a scary thought.
Brian, what's the story with Balmer's retirement? Do you think he's being forced out? Do you think it's an honest-to-God retirement? Do you think the board finally came to their senses?
Well, that is such a great question. I've actually thought a lot about that. I used to joke, or not even joke, I used to say that Steve Ballmer loved Microsoft enough to die for the company, but he didn't love Microsoft enough to quit. And I felt that very strongly. I mean, I obsess over motives. I obsess over context. I obsess over understanding why people do things, especially when it seems irrational or crazy, because very few people are actually crazy, and very few people are actually irrational. And when you see someone acting in an irrational or crazy fashion, almost every single time there's a missing piece of information that will make their actions make sense. Even if you don't agree with them, they will at least cease to appear irrational or crazy. And I noticed this a long time ago, and have since It's one of the things that I think about a lot. So I see someone acting crazy, I want to know why. And Microsoft has been a company that has seemingly been crazy. I mean, they make so many mistakes, and they do so many things wrong. And how Steve Ballmer, well, I know how Steve Ballmer has stayed in charge, but I lost, golly, Chuck, I do this with you all the time. I lose my train of thought.
Well, it's interesting. I agree with you. I don't think that crazy is the word, but just so obviously wrong in so many places, and so wrapped up in your own ideas. And I didn't notice I said wrapped up. I didn't say in love with, but so wrapped up in your own ideas that you can't see what's going on outside of your office.
Well, I wrote a piece a few months ago. I wrote a piece that was, 5 free tips for Microsoft's board. And the point of it was that there are people within that company who looked at the success of the iPad, and they came away with spending untold resources and understanding how Apple has been so successful with the iPad. And their takeaway from that was, what people really want is a tablet with a keyboard. That's crazy. I mean, there's no foundation for that. I mean, that is a delusional response to the iPad, and yet that's what we saw with Surface, and it's what we saw with Surface 2 that was announced this week. So my 5 free pieces of advice are, like, find the people that are responsible for that decision and fire them. That's one thing. Find the people who put together the advertising campaign for Surface and fire them too. Find the people who said no to these things and who said that these are bad ideas, and promote them, because those are the valuable ones, Yeah. And of course, it accumulated. Climax came together with the idea of firing Steve Ballmer because he's making terrible decisions. But we kind of know how this has happened, because under Steve Ballmer, Microsoft's revenue and profits have risen. That's the thing. The stock price hasn't gone anywhere because everyone knows that there's no real future for the company. But revenue and profits have actually risen. And this kind of comes back to that thing that Steve Jobs talked about. He said that when you take a product company and you put a marketing person or a salesperson in charge of a product company, innovation stops being the driving force for that company, and revenues become the driving force. That's what we've seen with Microsoft. Microsoft has, this was going back to, I think, either 2011 or 2012, Microsoft had 90,000 employees. 25,000 of them were sales and marketing. 25,000 of their 90,000 employees are sales and marketing. Now, let's look at Apple, a company that has far more revenue and now more profits. And Apple had, until recently, Apple had 300 people in its marketing department. As best as I've been able to figure out now, this part is definitely not a hard number. I believe Apple had about 1,000 salespeople, not counting people that are answering the phones with Apple's phone, and not counting their retail employees too. So, but the people that we traditionally think of as salespeople, people who make sales calls to enterprise and to retailers and that sort of thing, Apple had roughly 1,000 people in sales. Apple had 1,300 people in marketing. That recently has increased to about 500 people as part of Tim Cook's doubling down on secrecy. And so Apple's got, let's say that we're off by a factor of 2 for the sales team. So there's 2,500 people now in sales and marketing at Apple, compared to 25,000 people at Microsoft, because revenue became the driving force. So if you're going to protect revenue, you want to protect the goose that's laying the golden egg, which is, of course, it was Windows and its Office. And you want to do everything you can to protect those properties, to protect those franchises, and perpetuate them. And what we've seen with that is that Microsoft has made terrible decisions in order to do that. They killed off Courier, do you remember Courier?
Yep.
I thought that was a really interesting project. I don't know that I would have used it, but it was at least interesting. And it was Microsoft's completely thinking differently approach about tablets, and it was killed because it wasn't Windows.
And for the listeners who don't know, Courier was basically a book-like device that you would open up with a screen on the left and a screen on the right.
And a stylus.
And a stylus, yeah.
Okay. And you could drag things back and forth between the screens. It was really, really interesting.
Right.
It was really interesting. And they killed it because it wasn't Windows. We look at their eventual, I mean, it took them years to introduce Surface. Years to introduce that pile of crap. They spent, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of man hours. And what they came up with is Surface. I mean, that's just fascinating, right? But the problem is that the directive for Surface was make it extend Windows. And so you've got Surface that's burdened by the desktop legacy, and now you have desktop. This is all in the form of Windows 8. You've got the desktop being burdened by the baggage of a touch interface. It doesn't make any sense, and it's all because they're terrified of Windows going away. They're terrified of that revenue stream going away. You compare that to Apple. If Apple is happy to be the company that kills its own products, you take the iPod Mini, the most successful iPod at the time in history. Apple killed it and introduced the iPod Nano, which could be a completely different form factor, a completely different way of thinking about it. And then, of course, Apple introduced the iPhone, which killed the iPod. It's easy to forget, but there was a time when iPod was the product that was getting Apple all the attention. iPod was the product that was bringing people into the Apple stores where they sometimes also bought Macs. Apple killed the iPod with the iPhone. Apple is in the process of killing the Mac, or at least shortening its life with iPad. And because Apple is willing to move on to the next thing. Guys, do you remember Steve talking about before he came back to Apple? He said, if I was in charge of Apple, what I'd do is I'd milk the Mac for as long as I can and move on to the next thing.
Very well.
And it's what he did. It's exactly what he did. And it's exactly what Apple keeps doing. And Microsoft can't do that because they're being run by sales and marketing guys, which is Steve Balmer. They need a product guy in charge of that company. And so all of which I think I was originally talking about like I remember now, you asked about whether or not Steve was quitting or is being fired. Steve Ballmer said that he put this into motion a couple years ago. And at first I was wondering whether or not he was being ousted. I was suspecting he was being ousted by the board. But the fact that they gave him a year and the notion that he's the one who started this 2 years ago, I believe both of those little pieces of information. And I think that he may in fact love Microsoft enough to quit, that I was wrong about that.
The Surface, and especially now the Surface 2, really does fascinate me because you were talking about the Surface being burdened by Windows. What to me it seems like is it's burdened by Office. That Microsoft's answer to not everything, but almost everything is Office. And so they had to have Office on a tablet. And what they built was a perversion of a not great netbook. It wasn't really a tablet. It was a netbook in tablet clothing. I was about to say sheep's clothing, but so it was no. I mean, I'm sorry, but it really wasn't a surprise to me that there are a few people that it might appeal to until you started to look at just how it performed, and then you think, well, I'm going to get a cheap netbook and run with it.
Well, cheap netbook where you can play Angry Birds. It's got because it does have that touch thing. Yeah. But I'm going to offer a slightly different way of thinking about that. You said that their answer to everything is Office, and I actually think it's more like, oh my God, how are we going to keep Office relevant? And that is a slightly different answer. But the truth of the matter is that Microsoft could dramatically increase its tablet revenues by releasing a great version of Office for the iPad. They'd make a ton of money for that. I don't care if Apple's iWork products are free. That wouldn't change anything. Microsoft would sell a ton of copies of Office for iPad.
No question. at the very least, just because Office is Office, and there's still a lot of people that swear by Office, and that would it wouldn't validate the iPad, but it would validate the tablet model for those people who don't see a tablet as an option.
It's absolutely true, and it would make it would make a tablet a real solution for untold millions of people who are in corporate structures where Office matters, and Office does matter. And you look if you compare Office to Apple's iWork's products, Pages, Keynote, and Numbers. I love Pages, Keynote, and Numbers, but the only one that compares favorably to Office would be Keynote versus oh my gosh, what's
PowerPoint?
PowerPoint. Thank you, good Lord. And PowerPoint is still just a big piece of crap, and it makes ugly presentations, whereas Keynote makes beautiful presentations. The Keynote to me beats PowerPoint hands down. Numbers is a great spreadsheet, and if you're like small business and home, it does not compare to Excel. Excel is an amazing piece of software. And Word, is bloated and giant as it is, Word does so many things that Pages won't do. There are things that Pages does better, but as a whole, Word is a far more powerful piece of software. And for those reasons, I think that Microsoft could make a lot of money with Office for iPad.
I'm going to agree with you completely on Keynote. I am going to pretty much agree with you on Excel. And I think I don't know that Numbers is not as powerful for the real heavy, serious number crunchers.
But it makes better charts.
Listen, I think it's easier if you can abandon your Excel bias. I think it's easier to pick up and use, and definitely on the tablet.
Yeah, but if you want to do really complex business stuff, you need Excel.
Oh yeah, no.
On the formula side, on the macro side, all that stuff. There's stuff that Excel does that Numbers will never do. Yeah. But everything that Numbers does is so much prettier and better and easier.
Right. Exactly.
Than its corresponding Excel.
Yeah.
Parts.
And Word, Word is still a word processor. They've tried to integrate some page layout functionality into it, but it's still at its heart a word processor. And I feel like that's the difference. Pages at its heart is a page layout program, and that's where I see the difference.
Well, fair enough. The book industry still runs on Word. I don't think the book industry could switch to Pages if it wanted to. There are too many things that Word does that vertical industries absolutely rely on and need.
But Brian, I agree. It's a great point. But what fascinates me is Microsoft has been able to convince everyone that they need Word because they're in business. And I guarantee you that most of those people would be perfectly happy with Pages. They'd be perfectly happy with a public domain word processing program.
That's probably true. Things like business letters and short form stuff, I think Pages does a lot better. Yeah, it's the long form stuff that Word does better. Now that said, it's interesting. So you mentioned I'm writing a novel. I am. I'm writing that in Scrivener because Scrivener is such a great environment for writing a huge document. 100. In my case, I'm at 120,000 words. Word is such a miserable environment for managing something like that because it's linear. Have you used Scrivener yourself? No, I've heard a lot about Scrivener. I've opened it and played with it, but I can't say I've ever undertaken a project with it. So it's interesting. At some point, I'm going to have to. At some point, if I can sell my book, it'll actually transform. It'll be transformed by the publishing industry into a Word document, and from then on, I will be working in Word whether or not I like it. But the point is that the point is that it has these capabilities that are really, really valuable for long form works, but it's still not necessarily a great program to use on the creative side. But neither is Pages. I wouldn't want to write a book in Pages either. No,
I mean, we've gotten to a point where I think the day of the overall one size fits all tool is gone. I think there are probably better. I don't know for sure, but folks can tell me. But if you're an attorney, there are better programs for attorneys to process words. If you are a writer, there are better tools to process words. If you are an accountant, there are probably better tools to process words, and maybe you need Excel. But if you're an engineer, I mean, you don't need either one. You probably need a CAD program. I don't need a CAD program. I wouldn't know what to do with a CAD program. And that's where I feel like Microsoft has really done a great job, to their credit, of continuing to convince people that Office is needed, when I think there may be better, faster, simpler tools out there that could help streamline work without the expense and without the bloat of Word.
It's true, and that kind of brings us back to the idea that Microsoft is not willing to kill Office in order to move on to the next big thing. They would rather perpetuate the legacy of Office than come up with a new way, even for like a new concept of Office to exist. Everything Microsoft does is designed around perpetuating Windows in Office, and it's a losing strategy.
But don't you think, Brian, that it has something to do with the fact that they don't have any other ideas? And I realize that's a pretty broad statement, but when was the last time they introduced an idea that had some traction?
Well, that is a good point. Well, Xbox probably.
Okay,
the big one. Xbox has been, for a long time, Xbox was paid for by the profits of Windows and Office, but it eventually became a success on its own merits. But other than Xbox, it's been a long time, but I think some of that stems from the fact that Microsoft is not a place you go to when you've got great ideas, because the people that have had great ideas have had them shot down. To wit, Courier. Courier was really interesting. Courier could have been. It might have only been a niche product, but it could have been a successful niche product, and it got killed on the altar of Windows.
And we're using Courier as holding it up as the ideal. But I'm like you. I'm sure there have been a lot of great ideas that have gone by the wayside, but that's it. They've made the decision to go in the wrong directions, or they've either fallen in love with another new direction, and then when it comes out, it seems so obvious. The Zune, that just seems so obviously wrong. The Surface seems so obviously wrong. The advertising for the Surface you mentioned was so obviously wrong,
and it's still obviously wrong.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I just saw another one of those, Surface versus iPad things this morning on TV, and it's like, really, you're still trying to make this case.
Yeah, but my takeaway from those commercials is that if you don't know anything about either product, is Apple has a tablet that talks. That's
good point.
Microsoft's advertising has never been great, but the Surface advertisements have been particularly ill-advised. Unclear of their target market, unclear of their own message. The thing that stands out to me, the original dancing one with all the hipsters dancing in the plaza and the clicking, because we really care about whether or not our keyboards click to our tablets, is the angry schoolgirls dancing. Why are they angry? I'm assuming they're angry because they're in a Surface commercial, but they're dancing and they're these little girls and they're just angry. They have these fierce, unhappy expressions. Who made the choice? Someone told them to do that. There was a director who said, no, I want you to look angry. Yep. You look too happy. Stop smiling. Look angry. Someone made the choice. And then someone else had to make the choice to keep it in the commercial. How is that possible? I don't even get that, let alone all the dancing. What the hell? Pardon my language. What do dancing hipsters have? Those dancers, many of them were amazing. But how does that connect with the target market for Microsoft of people who want a tablet that runs Office? And then you put those same dancing hipsters around a big, massive conference table. Who's going to believe that any of those people work for a tech guy? It's just ridiculous. It's like they're a bunch of clowns in Redmond who are making these decisions, and they roll dice. They get their D&D. I've got my D&D. I've got a sound effect right here. They get their D&D dice out and they say, "Well, what decision are we going to make this week?" And then they do something like that, and then they make their decision.
Well,
it drives me nuts.
And let's not forget the wedding brawl video, which what you were saying. What I took away from that, the very last image that's actually video is the guy pulling open his shirt to reveal an Apple logo.
Yeah,
and it's like, why would you put that on right front and center on your commercial, your competitor's thing, a tattoo of an Apple logo on the chest?
Yeah, making the point that people love these products so much that they'll tattoo themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
The fascinating thing about that commercial in particular is that it does have a message, but that message speaks to partisans who have already made their decision. Right? The anti-Android jokes in that commercial are going to be funny to the Apple people, and the anti-Apple jokes in that commercial are going to be funny to the Android people. Well, how these are two camps that have already made their decision. No one else in the world cares. We sometimes get lost in the echo chamber. We sometimes start thinking that these things matter. They don't matter. No one cares. No one cares about Apple versus Android. And I don't. I just. What are we going to do this week, fellas?
Today's edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and for a limited time, a 20% discount, go to squarespace.com and use the discount code MacVoices9. Let's talk about Squarespace's many benefits. Wow, there are so many. I hardly know where to begin. Perhaps at the beginning? You can try Squarespace free for 14 days. Once you sign up, you start with one of Squarespace's many templates for business, photographers, bloggers, and other disciplines. And that's where your imagination takes over, because those templates can be customized in every fashion with drag and drop simplicity. Next, start adding photos. But don't worry about scaling or sizing them to fit. Squarespace takes care of that, making sure they look great right where you put them. Of course, there are those hundreds of millions of mobile devices that your site might show up on. No worries, Squarespace not only optimizes your site for pretty much every possible device, but also your photos, all automatically. It's like magic. Hey, it might just be magic. Next, get your social media accounts connected. Again, all built in and all easy. It takes just minutes rather than hours, and time is money. Speaking of money, if you have something to sell, Squarespace recently added e-commerce to their platform, so it's easy to set up shop and sell things. Squarespace provides the site and the platform. You have to provide the things. There's lots more, but that should get you started thinking that your old site is old, tired, worn out. You need something new. So go to squarespace.com right now and get that 14-day free trial. Then pick a plan that suits you. Plans start from just $8 a month, and if you sign up for a year, you get a free domain name. Then, to save even more, use the offer code MacVoices9 and take 20% off whatever plan you've selected. But don't wait, because that 20% discount won't last long. Squarespace, everything you need to create an exceptional website. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this edition of Mac Voices.
It's just crazy.
Well, we've beat on Microsoft for a while here, but it was too good not to to have you weigh in on Balmer. But what's your take on the new iPhone and iOS 7? I'm going to lump those two together simply because that the new iPhones seem to be designed to look good with iOS 7, or vice versa. It feels like to me that we're moving into a new era of Apple, of design and all, and we can debate whether that's a good idea or not, or whether it's effective. But are these products a good step forward, or they don't feel like a huge step forward, but they do feel like a step forward?
They're absolutely a step forward, and they're a step forward in strategy. At least the 5C is a step forward in strategy. So I bought into this notion that Apple was going to be releasing a plastic iPhone for emerging markets. It was going to be inexpensive. My personal assumption was it was going to be about $400. I kind of laughed at people who wanted it or said it would be $300. That sort of thing. That was ridiculous. And that they were designing this phone to be that inexpensive. And then when Apple turned around and released the device starting at $549 in Western markets for an unlocked phone, I was flabbergasted. It didn't make sense. I didn't understand why they would bother introducing a second new model if that was as cheap as they could make it. And that rang around in my head for a little while. But I finally understand why Apple did it and what's going on. The point of the 5C is for Apple to be able to have what used to be the previous generation device made less expensively. To wit, IHS released its their bill of materials for the 16 gig iPhone 5C was $173.45 counting, or 85 cents, I forget which, but whatever, $173 for bill of materials plus manufacturing costs. And that there's some error there. They're making a lot of educated guesses, but that's not the point. It's really useful from a sort of a relative standpoint, because the iPhone 5 was something like $197 to manufacture. And part of the issue with the 5 and the 5S alike is that the tolerances are so tight. There's, it's such a precision device that it costs more to make. In addition to the materials, there are a lot of manufacturing costs that deal with error rates and things having to be thrown back, or things just taking longer to put together because of how tight everything is. And Apple wanted to be able to sell this $99 and $199 version of these products in a way that was more profitable. And that's why the 5C exists. It's a way for Apple to have its middle of the weight still at the high end for everybody else, but it's middle entry. How am I trying to say this? It's the product that it positions in the middle, and be able to do it in a way that still maintains its gross margins. And that is actually going to be an important thing. So like next year, I think what we'll see is we'll see an iPhone 6 and we'll see an iPhone 6C. I don't think that the iPhone 5 and 5C will still be on the market next year. And by doing that, Apple is able to protect its margins when it's selling some of its cheaper products.
I'm going to put just a little different spin on it, and I'm curious to see if you agree. But I agree with what you've said about the financial decisions and all. I was relieved to see Apple not compromise its brand. I was deeply afraid when the analysts were pushing for cheap iPhones, and Apple could dominate this and they could take this. Well, first of all, they're not going to make any money, but in my mind, almost as importantly, they are not. They could have really stupidly devalued the brand by putting out a $100 iPhone.
Well, yeah, they're not. Apple's never going to do a $100 iPhone.
No, but
Apple is never going to do a $200 iPhone, and Apple's probably never, ever going to do even a $300 iPhone.
And that to me is the brilliance of it. They recognize brand value, and in a world where we seem to constantly rush to the bottom so we can get the biggest market share and make no money, this is a very refreshing and different tactic.
It's absolutely true. There is this weird thing with pundits, especially pundits. People like me, but people like me who don't actually know anything, who say that who want Apple to stop being Apple and to be like everybody else. There's just a lot of comfort in the notion for these people that Apple should be like everybody else, that Apple should be, going after market share, that market share for market share's sake matters. And it's weird. It's irrational. And I think for them, that missing piece of information is that Apple has made as much money as it has for a reason. And for them to want Apple to stop doing things the way Apple has done probably is going to mean that Apple will make less money. And I don't really get that. And I also don't get how people are missing the fact that most of Android's market share is irrelevant. People that are buying in at the low end aren't buying into the ecosystem. They're not being tied into the ecosystem. They're buying fancy feature phones that they text with and that they phone with and that they maybe take some photographs with. And if you look at emerging markets, you look at all of the companies, there are still tons of Android devices being sold that are being made as we speak, running Android 2.x, 2.2, and 2.3, sometimes even 2.1, especially in China. And those devices don't matter. They don't represent Android market share at all. And they in many cases, they don't have any Google services. So Google doesn't win. Google doesn't collect any information from these people that own these devices because they're not using any Google services. To wit, Google itself apparently doesn't care about any of these devices because they no longer count them in their fragmentation reports to developers. Google is very transparent about fragmentation, again, for developers so that they can know which versions of Android to develop for. But several months ago, Google switched from reporting activation fragmentation to reporting fragmentation only for those devices that access Google Play. Now, that's actually legitimate for developers because developers don't care about the devices that aren't accessing Google Play. But there's this sort of disingenuousness of it because Google still reports total activations, even though they apparently don't care about most of those activations because they don't include them in their own fragmentation report. So it's just this weird disconnect between people thinking that market share at the low end has any value when it does not. And that's one of the things that people are getting screwed up on when they want to try to apply it to Apple.
I think you've hit it right on the head. I think not just from the low end, but overall in general, I think that there is this, by pundits and analysts and all, that market share is the real important number here. It is to some degree, but you have to factor that in with profitability. And I think you have to factor it in maybe with the long game that where Apple is always reportedly playing, which I think they do, and they do very well. If Apple put out a $100 iPhone, well, they could probably wipe the floor with pretty much everybody else, but they'd make no money, and the iPhone cachet would be devalued completely.
But Apple could do a $400 iPhone. It could. What IHS said, and I often disagree with IHS, that their conclusions are often just wacky to me, but their teardowns seem pretty straightforward to me. And they said that if Apple wanted to maintain its usual margins for a $400 phone, it would have to have a bill of material of $130. Apple could probably do that if it was using iPhone 4, in this case, iPhone 4 or iPhone 4S components inside a new case that, an iPhone 5C like case. And Apple could probably still make a lot of money with such a device. If Apple could maintain its margins and increase the number of devices sold by a very large percentage, a $400 device with the right margins would do it. But Apple, has apparently decided they don't want to, and my guess is they're doing so for a reason, because Apple tends to do things for a reason.
No, I agree. Well, and what they sell? They sold 9 million iPhone 5s or 5Ss or 5Cs. Well, combined. iPhones, over opening weekend. We don't know the breakdown, but
Localytics is pegging it at roughly 3.4 to 1 for the 5S to 5C.
Yeah,
I imagine that's going to be pretty close.
Yeah, based on my experience over opening weekend, I would kind of agree with who was there for 5Ss versus 5Cs. and certainly later in the days, the early morning crowd was there for the 5S, but later in the day, I think the 5C crowd, came in. But and what I can't remember now. I'm afraid I'm going to overstate it, so I'm going to ask you: what was the iOS 7 adoption rate?
200 million units already.
Yeah, 200 million units. And as we record this, we're about a week in?
It's 2 weeks, right?
2 weeks?
Did it get?
No,
yeah, you're right. It's a weekend.
It's a weekend.
So
it's a weekend.
In less than a week, it was 200 million units.
Yeah. So, at some point, you have to ask, why would Apple need to compromise its strategy right now when it's working so well? When people are hot for the new iOS, with anything that'll run it, they're hot for the new iPhones. And by the way, folks, go back and listen to that again. 9 million new iPhones, 200 million iOS 7 device upgrades. 200 million. I think that speaks for itself.
Yeah, it's a staggering accomplishment, and one that Apple's not being given enough credit for in the non-Apple specific press.
No, because they didn't make any money off of it, so it's not seen probably as relevant. And if anything,
it's a sign of their success, and that's
and it's extremely relevant because now all those people are ready to take advantage of all the new built-in capabilities of iOS 7.
It's true. But where Apple is missing out, unequivocally, unquestionably, and in no way can it be argued against, Apple is missing out on a lot of sales in China and Russia and Brazil and India. And most of those sales, I would imagine, don't matter. I'm going to rephrase that. Most of those sales don't matter. Some of them do, though. A $400 device retail, which would probably still end up being closer to $550, maybe even closer to $600 in China because of all the various import tariffs and stuff that are added to such devices. That such a device would dramatically increase Apple's market share and still probably be profitable again if they could make one if they could make one with the right margins. And the fact that Apple is letting those sales go, I do think it's something that Apple is continuing to think about and wanting to address in some capacity or another. But it's going to be clearly it's going to be if Apple ever addresses it, it's going to be something that they address when they're ready to do it in the way that they want to do it.
And I realize at least one of us on this show sounds like an Apple fanboy, but isn't it refreshing to see someone take their time and do it in a measured fashion instead of just rushing something out? Gee, I wonder who I could be thinking about. Oh, Samsung with a gold phone.
Style is uniquely yours.
Yeah. It's in a world where it just seems like so many people react. It's refreshing to see someone act and let everybody fall around them.
It's true, and it's also refreshing to see Apple stick to the strategy that has made the kinds of products that we love, and not just abandon that for the because Apple is such a big company. To dramatically increase sales and revenue for Apple is going to take it's going to take another disruptive market of some sort, and it's probably going to take another disruptive market that was an area where Apple is already competing. I don't know when and if Apple is going to be able to do so, but think about Apple becoming a company that does $250 billion a year in sales. I mean, that would be just a monster corporation. Just a monster corporation, and Apple is not pursuing that. Apple is not pursuing sales. Apple is continuing to pursue the idea of making the best product. And like you, I do find that refreshing, and I do find I'm glad that Apple has looking at the notion of big screens. There are people who people who apparently like big screen phones, who think that Apple is somehow failing by not releasing a big screen phone. But to me, when I look at the quality of a product like the Galaxy S4, I think that Apple is making the right decision. I think that when Apple tells us they can't make a big screen device that doesn't include compromises, that they're telling the truth. That's one area where I'm glad that Apple hasn't definitely has not embraced a reactionary attitude.
Agreed. And how many horror stories did we hear before the new iPhones were announced? That, if Apple doesn't bring up, a phablet-sized phone, oh my God, they're going to have their lunch eaten by Samsung and Nokia and all these others. And 9 million iPhones in the first weekend.
Yep. Well, it's interesting what some people look at Samsung's monstrous sales, because Samsung is definitely the market leader in terms of sheer numbers of devices, and they somehow conflate the notion that Samsung has big devices that sell well with the notion that therefore means that there are more phablets being sold than iPhones, and that's not the case. You take all of the phablets being sold, and iPhone still outsells them. And I don't know. It's really it's just really interesting, the prism through which many people seem to look at life.
Well, not just life, but more from a business perspective. I guess I'm looking at it and thinking, okay, sometimes you got to look around you. Well, I just finished accusing Microsoft of not looking around and seeing what was happening, but there's also something for looking around, trying to copy everything, or trying to just say, "Oh, me too." I need a music player, and I need, in the Samsung case, I need a gold iPhone. I need a pink iPhone, or excuse me, I need a gold phone. I need a pink phone. I need whatever, and they just won't play that game. They are going to do what they want to do, and I really, really hope that it remains ingrained in the company's DNA to do that.
Well, you say that, and I think that that's one of the key aspects about Tim Cook's leadership at Apple. A lot of outsiders have called Tim Cook a failure, and that he can't innovate, and the company can't innovate without Steve Jobs. All this stuff, and it's so ridiculous. Can you imagine what would have happened to Apple if some other Steve Jobs came in to replace Steve Jobs?
It would have torn it apart.
It would have torn it apart. The result may have been great. The eventual result, the eventual result may have been astounding. But first of all, there is no other, extra Steve Jobs lying around. It's just kind of waiting to take up the mantle of the company. But beside that, it would have torn Apple apart, and because the new guy would have needed to, and probably would have been appropriate. It would have been appropriate for him to do so, to rebuild the company in his image, because he's a Steve Jobs. And Tim Cook's role has been to shepherd Apple into a post-Steve Jobs era, to ensure that the Apple way is institutionalized and is part of the culture, and can continue without Steve Jobs. That's Tim Cook's biggest role, is to make sure that Apple remains the kind of company that can continue to innovate. No one else could have done this. No one else besides Tim Cook could have done this. Tim Cook is an astounding CEO. To be able to take over from a man like Steve Jobs and have everything be as smooth as it has been, to not lose all your executives. I used to worry that Steve Jobs was the glue that held all those great minds together. That he was the one that kept everyone together. And it was probably the case with Scott Forstall, in that it took someone like Steve Jobs to keep Scott Forstall in his place. But the reality is that I don't miss Scott Forstall. I'm glad that he's gone, and I don't like the effect he was having on Apple anyway. But the point is that there's been this continuity at Apple that is absolutely astounding when you consider the magnitude of the loss of someone like Steve Jobs from the company. And I don't think anybody besides Tim Cook could have done it. And God, you look today, Tim Cook is still running operations. Tim Cook is effectively running retail, although there are lower level executives who handle stuff, but they're reporting to him because there's no head of retail. Tim Cook still has responsibility over products, probably nowhere near the hands-on degree that Steve did, but that is still part of his job, and he's still involved with the finance side too. I mean, I can't even imagine how he does that, and I don't think anyone else could have.
I agree. I agree with you completely. I think Tim Cook is his own kind of rock star.
Totally.
Steve had the charisma and all, but Tim is completely his own kind of rock star. And having been through corporate transitions of a number of different kinds, and folks, if you've never been through them, let me tell you, it's hard to believe how a corporate culture can change in a day with the institution of a new regime. And, it can go from great to terrible, terrible to great, and all points in between. And the fact that, at least from the outside, now maybe some Apple people would see this and they'd say, well, not quite. But certainly from the outside, certainly from the product, the service, the quality standpoint, there was not a hiccup.
Nope, there wasn't. And the one question of whether or not Apple can continue to innovate without Steve Jobs is a question that cannot be answered for another couple of years still. For one thing, everything that Apple's released in the last since Steve Jobs died still had Steve Jobs' touch on it one way or another. And we need to see it's going to take time to be able to see whether or not Apple can what am I trying to say, Chuck? I'm doing a terrible job of doing it. It will take time to be able to truly measure Apple's ability to innovate, and we haven't. That amount of time is not passed yet. To me, it's a 3 or 4 year, maybe even a 5 year issue post Steve Jobs before you can actually, one way or another, say that Apple can innovate or can't innovate. And anyone saying that the proof is here now is just wrong.
No, I agree, and yet everybody's so quick to rush to judgment about Tim Cook and about the post Steve Jobs Apple. And folks, you got to remember, I mean, this stuff does take time to develop. They didn't just start working on iOS 7, the day after iOS 6 came out. I mean, there were plenty of things that were already in the drawing boards, and probably, iOS 8 is out there still, being worked on before iOS 7 came out, and maybe even before iOS 6 came out.
You say that, Chuck, and I actually think that Apple and Craig Federici and Johnny Ive should get an enormous amount of credit for being able to take over iOS 7 and release it in effectively 10 months with a completely new look and feel. Yes, there were some things that were in development before Scott Forstall left, but it was in November when Craig took over the engineering side and Johnny Ive took over the design side. That was 10 months ago. And to be able to release iOS 7 and have it be as completely different as it is, this complete overhaul of the operating system, not to mention all the new features that were added too, it's an astounding accomplishment.
Yeah, and I think we forget just how deep the operating system goes. Not from just from a functional standpoint, but from all the little visual cues, all the design touches. There's so many things. I mean, even now, I'm still discovering things in iOS 7 that I'm not even sure were ever documented anywhere. That about 99.9% of them I like. One or two I question whether this is a designer's thing and could it be improved a little bit from a functional standpoint. But overall, it's an amazing accomplishment, and it just speaks to the fact that I want to continue to own Apple products and use Apple products.
Likewise.
And not just because I'm an Apple guy, but because I want to use them. They make me better.
Yeah, fair enough.
Bryan, we got to do this more often.
We do.
Okay. Next time.
We say that every few months. We say that too.
I know. Well, both of us get busy, and you got interns to manage and all that.
Yeah.
It's and books to write and songs to sing and whatever else. I don't know.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah. Bryan, give us a quick shot. Where can you be reached, and where can you be found on the social networks?
I am on Twitter. It's TMO Bryan. That is Bryan with a Y, because that's how I spell my name. It's kind of convenient how that worked out. And my personal blog is at geektells.com. It's TELLS. And I'm on app.net, but I tend to not ever actually post anything there. And that's where, what am I there? I'm actually Bryan Chaffin on app.net. And of course, I'm at macobserver.com.
Great. And the Apple Context Machine, of course.
And the Apple Context Machine, yeah.
So, folks, I'll have links to all of that in the show notes so you can find
Jamie.
Bryan, and we'll get him back here more often. Bryan, it's a lot of fun. Hopefully next time we'll get to see you.
Thanks, Chuck.
All right, take care.
You too.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacNotables on Mac Voices. We will be back again soon. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, app.net, Google+, Facebook, and for more Apple, Mac, and tech-related shows, including Mac Voices, MacNotables, the Mac Jury, and the Mac Voices Briefing. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com.